She is of Philadelphia. I mention this only because she's from Philadelphia, and it has been restored. It is the only flying 1930s autogyro in existence today. Again, some publicity about it. This is the Kellett Company, their first model. That's another licensee. This is Wanda La Cierva. That's their second aircraft. They are also developing American autogyros. You're picking up in England. This is a French conception of a fanciful autogyro. Again, from 1932. We're not there yet. What's missing from that aircraft? There are no wings. That did not exist, but that's where we're going. Pitcairn builds a 5-passenger aircraft. It gets very expensive, very luxurious. It's designed by Robert Nordham, who does some of the Luscombe aircraft and the Aranca. It's a beautiful aircraft. They sell 5. One goes to England, one goes to Scotland. None of them exist today. There is, beginning in 1935-36, some conceptions of perhaps this could be a weapon of war. Again, it gets publicity. They land at Soldiers Field in 1933 for the Carnegie Medal. That medal, by the way, is presented by Edwin Aldrin, Buzz Aldrin's father. This is the most interesting. This is not a very good photo. This is the Hafner gyroplane, not an autogyro, in England. The reason that I put it in is that if you look up here, right up here, what you're seeing is what he called the spider gear. We would later call it the swash plate. And it's out here on every helicopter. This is an autogyro. But Hafner is the transitional figure. He's the one that uses the autogyro as a platform to develop the control mechanisms for the helicopter. Here in Pennsylvania, this is Burke-Wilford. This is a feathering mechanism where you can actually tilt the blades. It's not successful, but it's a different form of control. But this is where the autogyro goes. No wings. Why? Because you have a fully articulated rotor head. You can tilt it in any direction. Now all control is vested in the rotor head. This is the Cierva C-30A. It will be responsible for saving the world. This is what it looked like. I'll explain that. Again, it gets a great deal of publicity. Here's a Kellett direct control. Again, no wings. Taking off in front of the Capitol. It could do a jump takeoff. Spin the rotor up, snap it into a positive incidence, up you go. Cierva experiments on a carrier. This is the Weir company coming up with their version of it in England. Now, this is Rolf von Bahr in Sweden in 1937 with a Cierva C-30. This is the first direct control jump takeoff in America. This is the PA-22. A lot of speculation about now helicopters in every garage. This is the AC-35. It is delivered to, it's a rotable job. You can land it and drive it. It's driven up to the Department of Commerce. It's in the Smithsonian collection. And here it is landing. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through the third one, but I want to tell you why this saved the world. The direct control autogyro was used by England to calibrate radar during the Battle of Britain. And they would go out and they would circle a point while they calibrated the radar. And that was the radar that let the RAF stop the Germans and, in effect, win the Battle of Britain. That is not the only role. If I had time to go through the rest, I would show you the Japanese flew an autogyro in World War II. They actually supposedly dropped bombs on a U.S. submarine. Rolf von Bahr, the reason that slide's there is he will fly that doing resupply and search and rescue missions during World War II in Sweden. There was a role for the autogyro. But by and large, what is happening during this period is very simple. The first helicopter in Germany, the Fa-61. More importantly, it's demonstrated in 1936 and in 1937. It's publicly demonstrated. It's first flown in 1936. It's demonstrated in 1937. And in order to show the prowess, Hermann Göring, who's head of the Luftwaffe, invites Charles Lindbergh to come to Germany to see it fly inside the Deutsches Hall. Now, it's flown by Hannah Reich, the first of the Whirly Girls. You know why she was selected? A, she's the Lady Lindy. She's very photogenic. B, she's very small and light, because this thing could not lift a whole lot. The rumor is that the spectators sucked out so much oxygen from the Deutsches Hall that the engine couldn't function. They had to actually pipe oxygen in. I don't know if that's true. What I do know is that Charles Lindbergh will send a report back scaring the hell out of everyone, because now the focus will not be merely on vertical flight and landing and takeoff, because the autogyro can now do a jump takeoff, can jump 40 feet in the air. It can now land dead stick. The one thing that it can't do, because it's not a powered rotor, is hover. But that is the one thing that the American military wants, that it now demands. And that's going to lead the military and the national interest into the helicopter, and I believe subsequent speakers are going to pick that up. There's a lot more. There's a whole other presentation. It's in your thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. That was an amazing tour de force. Don't know where to begin to thank you for that. Our next speaker, I think, picks up the story quite amazingly, and picks up the story in a way that only he can. Our next speaker bears one of the most famous names in aviation history, and that name is Igor Sikorsky. He is, of course, Igor Sikorsky, Jr. And I've asked Igor to come and talk about his father and his father's approach to issues dealing, we've got a lot of noise out there from a helicopter, dealing with the questions of helicopter flight and dealing with the questions of innovations in helicopter flight. I think it is very fitting that we should welcome Igor Sikorsky, Jr., a fellow member of the bar, and hear what he has to say about his experiences and his father's experiences with this wondrous technology. Igor.
Bruce is a tough act to follow, and he's covered a lot of the history, so I'm going to try to tell you some of the personal history from my father. As you saw some pictures here, my father, and as already you've heard, my father, as a child, read the Jules Verne and, of course, saw the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci. And when you saw the photographs here of the first helicopter he built, that was built on the coaxial concept, the pictures that you saw. I'm going to try to keep to my time here. Now, father, from the very beginning of his career, dreamed of a helicopter. And he built his first, he was born in 1889, and when he heard of the Wright brothers, that inspired him. Now, there were no aviation industry, no engine industry worth in Russia in 1909. My grandfather, his father, gave him a pile of gold money and sent him to Paris, because that was then, in those years, the center of aviation, Lindbergh Field. And by the way, if you had sent me with a pile of money to Paris, as a 19-year-old, I wouldn't have spent all the time at Lindbergh. But that was his dedication. So he got an engine, and he brought it back to Kiev and built his first helicopter in 1909. Now, I want to say that this was, Dad, I heard him say, this was a very good helicopter. It raised clouds of dust. It scared the chickens and made a lot of noise. And it had many strange vibrations. See, so that's typical. Nothing's changed. But unfortunately, it had one technical defect. It couldn't fly. But other than that, it was a great helicopter. But it had a 25 horsepower engine. And years later, in going through my father's effects, he had a 1936 Encyclopedia Britannica. And in it was a paragraph entitled Helicopter. And he underlined that. And it said in 1936 that helicopters would be extravagant, of power. And if you're an engineer, you know what we're talking about. And so when Father built the first two helicopters, he realized intuitively, and by the way, he believed in intuition. They had nothing else to work with in 1909, 1910, as far as knowing what was going on. He didn't know all of at that time, of the background that Bruce pointed out. He had minimum. He did know of Urev's work, and you notice that it was designed, we had pictures of it that were similar to the configuration that ultimately Father ended up with. So he turned to conventional aircraft. And in 1913, he built the first four-engine plane in the world. And I have pictures, I have some photos of that, so if anybody's into aviation history, I have them here in a bag. If anybody's interested in some photographs of those early days. He built them, and then and he built planes for the Imperial Russian Air Force. And then the revolution came on, and he had to flee for his life, and he came eventually to America. By the way, he is genuinely a pioneer, because we credit him with 3 careers. He had his Russian career building conventional aircraft. Then he came to America, where he was very active in building amphibians and seaplanes. And that was all in the 1930s, and that's, by the way, when he met and worked with Charles Lindbergh, and Pan American had a number of the amphibians. But now he came, and he kept in touch with everything that was going on in helicopters. He also was with Charles Lindbergh in that trip to Germany in 1938, and saw what progress they had there. But in 1938, several things happened. One of them was that the amphibian gradually faded out as the principal passenger plane. That's for a lot of reasons, and I won't take up your time with it, but trust me that the amphibian, by the late 1930s, it had dominated passenger and pioneered passenger travel in the earlier part of the 1930s. But by late 1930s, it dried up, and some people, and by that time, Sikorsky Aircraft was a part of what was then called United Aircraft, which is now United Technologies. And they sent for Father, and they said, we're going to close your plant. And he talked them into letting him experiment with the helicopter. They thought he was crazy, but they also thought that he had proven himself in other things. By the way, I want to say that sometimes people would introduce my father and say this was the inventor of the helicopter. And he never claimed that. Couldn't claim it. He knew too much of how much he was dependent on all the people who came before him. So he would never claim that he was an inventor of the helicopter. By the way, I also should say, my father was raised in Russia, and he would, first years, he did not say helicopter. He said heliocopter, following the Greek. So he came and he started. What did he do? Now, I told you about how he built planes in Russia 30 years earlier. And what you did then was you built a plane, and you got into it, and you didn't know if the plane could fly, and you didn't know how to fly it. But that's what you did. And so when he came to the helicopter, he approached the helicopter in late 1938 and into 1939 the same way. Now we have at the New England Air Museum the initial, I don't have pictures of it, but the initial test stand. And what the first thing they did was put a test stand with about 10 feet tall, and they ran different shapes of rotors blades. You see, so you had, and they did them and they measured the lift. And they did that for months. And he also built and had another test stand with a tail rotor type to test how to control it. So ultimately what they did was they built, and then Father went to the staff and he said, build me a platform. Build me something that we can move around very simply. And we'll get in it and fly it. And that's what they did. And on September 14th, 1939, they flew for the first time. Now, that we use as the first flight of what became known as the VS-300. Some people ask, well, how did they get to that title? How did you say VS-300? Well, in those days, they were already part, as I said, of United. And so he went to United and said, I need a new designation, but it's got to have 3 in it because I built 2 helicopters in Russia, and this is my 3rd helicopter. So VS-300 is the number, and that's what that plane. And you see, I think we've handed out to you the VS-300. This is a later version, and about the way it came very close. You'll notice in the photograph that we gave you, it's no coverage. Why? Because they kept changing it. They had 57 different changes between the initial platform and what you ultimately ended up being the what Dad called his sweet ship. And I have to say that you've covered a lot of the ground here. Let me see what my, we talked about that I already said that he's not the inventor. He was also, one time, I remember he made a speech and someone very, very eloquently introduced him as the man who learned to break all the laws of gravity. And Dad said, no, I didn't learn to break the laws of gravity. I learned to obey them. And that was what his life was devoted to, how you do that. The work here in the VS-300, and I have a video of that, and I'll be glad to send that to anyone who would like to see. You have it?
It's on the disk. Everyone has it.
Oh, everyone, the video?
Yes.
Wow, okay. Then you're way ahead of me. And the video, okay, that's good, because it shows the early work that from September on, they started experimenting, and they had in the back, the tail rotor, the whole business of control was a tremendous problem. And for the first year, finally, they could hover, they could fly. One time someone was there and watching it, and he said, well, I notice you've gone sideways, and you hover, and you go backwards, but I haven't seen you go forward. And he said, it's a small technical problem we haven't solved yet. And actually, that was a headache for about 9 months. They flew it. They did everything they could to figure out how to get it to go forward. Okay? And in fact, they were so desperate about that they thought that, well, the only thing we can do is turn around the cockpits. They turn around the seats and we'll go all right that way. So they actually did have drawings of turning the cockpit around somehow or other so they could go forward. And that's the only way they could do it. So that was one of the things that they had problem. You talked about auto-rotation. Bruce talked a little bit about auto-rotation. One time someone, old lady came up to Dad and, said, what happens, and he was speaking about helicopters, and they said, what happens if the engine fails? And Father said, no problem at all. We teach the pilots auto-rotation, and that, there. Then the lady said, what happens if a rotor breaks? Dad stopped and said, we don't recommend that. So there you are. I haven't tried to cover everything, and I'm trying to keep within the time. I want you to know that in your package you have a disc. I recommend you take a look at it. That's where the very first period. And finally, by the way, it's interesting. I'll just have 1 minute more. Colonel, then I think it was Captain Frank Gregory, was then head of the rotary department of the U.S. Army. And they were of course, everything air was part of the Army at that time. And so he came to visit and saw the helicopter and helped steer a contract through. And now, by the way, I have some of the letters, and right now, people would go to jail for the way they stacked the contracts. But he was, he was convinced that then, and there were competition here. I want to say, by the way, and sometimes some of my fellow friends from Stratford, where there's a small helicopter installation, and they would come by, and my friends in Stratford resent when Philadelphia says they're the birthplace of air, but I think it's a very legitimate claim on the part of Philadelphia because of the work really of Pitcairn to start with and others. So I think I got about 3 minutes. If there's a question.
Yes, sir. I have an off-the-wall question. It has to do with.
Use the microphone. Come to the microphone.
Come on up.
I'm Colonel John Diori. I'm an Air Force junior ROTC instructor over in New Jersey in Salem County. I have a couple of my cadets with me, and I teach aviation history. And this is like fascinating to hear you speak. I feel honored to even know that you're here. I mean, we talk about you in my class every day, and your dad. It's incredible, But other than that, what do you think brought your dad to Connecticut? Why Connecticut of all places, of all the cradles of aviation around America? Why Stratford, Connecticut?
That I can answer. There are a lot of questions, technical questions I can't, but that one I can actually answer. Remember, I mentioned to you that Father, after he came from Russia, started building planes, and he first built them in Long Island. And they were right next to the old Roosevelt Field. Unfortunately, Roosevelt Field now is, I think, a shopping center rather than the field. But that's the field, by the way, from which Lindbergh took off. And Dad then built a number of planes. He had a trimotor plane that they were thinking about, that they was designed to fly the Atlantic and for the Ortega prize. There used to be a prize. It was $25,000 to be the first plane, and that was the prize that made Lindbergh. At any rate, they were in Long Island, and that he was making conventional planes. But he made a twin-engine amphibian, and it was a real amphibian. It was land and sea. It was the S-38, meaning S. Sikorsky 38th model, and it just was a tremendous success for the time. Before then, they always built planes for a spec. In other words, they didn't build planes on spec up to that time, and it was built in 1928. But it was so successful, and they knew it would be, that they started just simply an assembly line. Now, you might not think 114 or 118 planes, but in 1928, to turn out 128 of the same model was quite unusual, and it put the company on the there. Now, it's an amphibian. And Dad is then saying he has to move, and he wants a place where he has the mouth of a river, so they could go from a plant to the mouth of a river, and the river be very close to Long Island Sound. Okay? So he came to Connecticut. By the way, we were almost in Old Saybrook. I don't know if you know Connecticut, but we almost went to Old Saybrook. But he went to Stratford, and there was a young general counsel at that time, a guy who went on to fame in Connecticut, Ray Baldwin, who was later on governor and senator and a whole lot of other fame. But then he was, in 1929, he was the general counsel, and he talked Dad into coming to Stratford. Now that is a long-winded answer, but that's how they came, because that's what they wanted, and then for the next 10 years, they built amphibians. One other last personal observation. I was a kid when all this was going on, and people say, what did you think about it? I didn't know. Listen, 8 or 9-year-old doesn't really get terribly excited about these things. I remember in May 1941, and I would then be 12 years old, and the helicopter, the VS-300 that you see here, was setting the world record for endurance, and it was, I think, 1 minute and 35. 1 hour and 35 minutes, and they're hanging up there, and we were all playing in the field. Real sense of history. I will also say, and I told you, and this is a personal observation, I told you how many changes they had and how simple the frame was. And I remember, I must have been around that a little bit younger, and I remember vividly my father going up to some mechanics and saying, and at those days, and I think there's some pictures of it, the tail rotor had had 2 wing rotors on it too. All of this in an effort to develop control. And I remember Father coming up to someone and saying, let's cut those off. And tonight, will you take your blowtorch and cut them off? And that's what he did. That's what the fellows did. The next morning, Dad flew it in a different configuration. And they did not. People have asked me, are there any blueprints? No, there are no blueprints. They didn't make blueprints. And they didn't have to worry about FAA or anybody looking over their shoulder and saying, you can't do this. But those are the things they did. And I'm going to be around if you have any other. Yeah.
I was very impressed by what you said about your father's test bed and his tireless experimentation. I'm wondering whether his company or the helicopter business in general received any help from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in the era prior to World War II.
I haven't run into any. I've gone through a lot of Dad's papers, and I think he was knowledgeable. All I could say, I can't answer that really. I will say that he was knowledgeable about what was going on. I do know that he came to a symposium in, I think, 1938 or thereabouts, right? He came to a symposium, but he wasn't the star. He was attending it, listening to what was going on. So the
government did advise him to license Pitcairn's patents. And it should be noted that the Sikorsky Company became a Pitcairn licensee. They used rotary wing patents, Harold Pitcairn's patents, in their aircraft. And later, when there would be a patent suit for patent infringement, the Sikorsky Company was not included because they dutifully were licensed, they dutifully paid their royalties. They were literally one of the good guys.
I could also add something to that, because I also remember that. Dad they did a, there was a patent infringement lawsuit, okay, 1 minute. And it's the last question. And Dad was told to, he had a deposition. They took his deposition. And of course, the people at United then wanted him to say that he was told everything he did was totally independent. And he said, no, I was very, very much influenced by the patents and the work of Pitcairn.
There's one other thing to remember, because the theme of this conference is innovation. Igor Sikorsky is famous for saying, and I assume he passed this on to his children, that aircraft designers should fly their own creations. There would therefore be fewer bad airplanes and fewer bad airplane designers.
And wait a minute, I have one more. One time I was in a speech and I was giving a presentation. It was a symposium on what it's like to have a famous father and a famous name. And I was there and I talked about, the advantages and disadvantages of coming from famous name. Finally, after I was through, this little lady came up to me and she said, oh, I thought your father was such a brilliant man. And she raved and raved about it. And the more she raved, the more puffed up I was. And then finally she ended up saying, and I just loved his last symphony.
Thank you, Igor. Tremendous. We're going to move right along since, as is fairly typical for these sessions, we're now behind schedule. And so I'm going to queue up our next speaker while I introduce him. Our next speaker is also a famous name in rotary wing aviation history. He is Fred Piasecki, the son of Frank Piasecki, and if you walk out of this door, you will see a blue helicopter here, and immediately in front of it, you'll see a bust of Frank. Frank was a tremendous supporter of this museum, as well as a trustee of FPRI, so we have many, many connections with the Piasecki family. And